I, like you, would have been deeply, deeply shocked to see that there has been a 1,000% increase in anti-Semitic crimes as recorded by the British Transport Police. That is following the October the 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. This is a very worrying trend here in the UK, and joining me in the studio to talk about it is former military intelligence officer Philip Ingram, and down the line is Daniel Bett from Yaqid, a British Jewish organisation that advocates for resolution of conflicts. Philip, starting with you, just extraordinary figures, 1,000% increase recorded by British Transport Police.
Well, it's an extremely worrying trend, and especially at this time of the year, because a lot of the people who are coming out with their anti-Semitic views will then be celebrating Christmas, the birth of King of the Jews, and you're going to chapel and saying their Hail Marys, the mother of the King of the Jews, and you're getting that clear lack of understanding of what they are crying about and what they're talking about.
On this clear lack of understanding, I just find it absolutely extraordinary. We've allowed these marches to take place in London where people have been chanting from the river to the sea, which is an anti-Semitic trope that really is saying, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, we want to see the Jewish people wiped off the map. Don't you think it's absolutely extraordinary that Metropolitan Police have allowed this to take place in central London?
I think it is extraordinary that it's been allowed to go at the levels it's at. There's a real difficulty. If the police try and interfere with the tens of thousands of people that are on the streets at that time, that could lead to more violence.
Well, but you query whether the marches should have been allowed.
Well, exactly. And this is where, when we're hearing those cries coming out more routinely through a lot of very naive people who really don't understand and then try to justify with some strange reasoning as to why they're coming out with those
Danielle, thank you so much for joining us down the line. Would you recognise what Philip says is that people who are taking part in this appalling anti-Semitic behaviour don't really understand what they are doing, or is it the low-lying anti-Semitism towards the Jewish people we see in society all the time?
So every time that there is a conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, there is an increase of anti-Semitism and of Islamophobia. And I don't think that the average person who is showing solidarity with Palestine or indeed going to a march hates Jews. I don't think that most people who want to see an end to the war hate Jews. However, I do think that more and more of the conversation, people blur the lines between criticizing the Israeli government and between blaming Jews and holding Jewish people accountable for the actions of Israel. And also much of the dialogue isn't just about criticizing Israel, but it's also tied to conspiracy theories which blame Jews and hold Jews to a different standard to anyone else that you wouldn't hold any other minority to when talking about this geopolitical issue. And so I think the lines have become very much blurred between the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
But do you think when you say that most people go on a pro-Palestinian march calling for the end of the war probably aren't anti-Semitic, I don't know if I'd necessarily disagree with that point of view, but where they allow themselves to be sort of washed along in the crowd and take part in these anti-Semitic chants, haven't they crossed the line, whatever their original purpose for attending that march, haven't they crossed the line into being anti-Semitic and attending an anti-Semitic march?
I think it's difficult to accuse that large number of people of being anti-Semitic just because they are in the presence of some individuals who choose to say anti-Semitic things. And I mean, I think if you look at what's happening in Gaza, the huge humanitarian crisis in Gaza, it makes sense that people would want to show solidarity with Palestinians. Having said that, a lot of people are ignorant. A lot of people don't understand the nuance of the conflict and what is actually going on. They don't understand the difference between certain flags and banners that they're waving.
And Philip, this is a real problem, isn't it, for the left here in British politics? They don't seem to... The left, which, has a lot of its roots in the sort of anti-racism sort of movement here in the UK, don't seem to be able to sort of understand that quite a lot of what has been going on is, this sort of pro-Palestinian. It's a completely reasonable position for people today to be pro-Palestinian and not want to see the end of this humanitarian tragedy. But quite a lot of it is rooted in anti-Semitism, isn't it?
It seems to be, and there's a lack of understanding of bigger issues. We don't see the same people protesting about other atrocities that are going on around the world. So there's you have to question their motivation. You know, if they wanted to be just focusing on looking after the Palestinian people, which I think is right and proper, because it's the Palestinian people that are suffering. They're suffering at the hands of Hamas. They're suffering at the hands of the Israeli response that there is. But you've got people all around the world that are suffering in different conflicts. We're not seeing the same protests that are there. If we had this sort of chants that were coming out when we got the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on, and there were anti-Black Lives Matter protests going out, and some, if the language got inflammatory in there, I think it would have been dealt with much quicker and much harsher by the Metropolitan Police and by the Lord Mayor of London, or sorry, the Mayor of London, not the Lord Mayor, the Mayor of London, and closing them down.
And Danielle, you, I'm sure, would accept that there's also been coupled with this rise in anti-Semitism, a big rise in Islamophobia. Does this sort of just point out the bigger problem we have here in the UK with conflicts thousands of miles away in some cases being sort of fought and played out on the streets of London and other major cities around the UK?
Yeah, so I think in many ways it does become a culture war and a proxy war. I advocate for a solution to this conflict, so I want to see people talking about it, but the way in which the dialogue has happened, and quite often mainly online, it's incredibly toxic. We have seen so much fake news and so many conspiracy theories being spread. There's actually been a huge rise in far-right white Americans who also spread similar conspiracies that you see on the far left, and they've had a huge rise in popularity online, and nothing is being done by social media platforms, or very little is being done by social media platforms to stop the rise of fake news, of hatred, of violence. And so I think that there is a wider issue, which is, where is this information being spread? Where are people getting their information from? A lot of people are getting their information online, and a lot of that information is not only wrong, but it's inflammatory, and you see incitement to violence and hatred.
And is this move away? We were talking earlier in the show about 3 in 10 young Americans surveyed by the Daily Mail believe that 9/11 and the attacks on the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center was positive. And that has been linked to people just getting their news from TikTok and online and almost living in a walled garden of people who agree with you. Can you see that fueling this sort of misinformation, Danielle?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a good example from the 7th of October is that when women started giving their testimonies and talking about sexual violence and rape on the 7th of October, there was a huge wave of denials from people that we would expect to be on our side, from women's organizations even, or people who consider themselves to be radical feminists. And I think that really is shocking, but it's not coming out of nowhere. It is coming out of the informations that they're getting. The algorithms are also linked to that. And I do believe that social media platforms have to be held accountable when they spread fake news about Palestinians and about Israelis, that also put people in an echo chamber where they not only hear what they want to hear, but are kind of pushed further down a rabbit hole where they get more negative information that makes them more radical in their views.
And Daniela, just to talk about the impact this is having on families here in the UK, I'm often struck by the conversations I have with a very good friend of mine who's just living in the northern border region of Israel. I spoke to him just a couple of weeks ago, and as I was talking to him, an air raid siren went off as rockets were coming over from the Lebanon. And as that siren was going off, he was telling me that he was more concerned about his parents living in Greater Manchester, attending the shul, or the synagogue, as we would call it, more concerned about the challenge they face from anti-Semitism in the UK than he faced being in a war zone in northern Israel. Is that a common feeling around British Jewish families here in the United Kingdom, fueled by these sort of statistics we've seen today?
Listen, I think it's a very difficult comparison because it depends what situation you are. And I don't like to compare the situation of being in a war zone. Many people have their kids fighting in Gaza, or many people are still waiting on their families, hostages being returned home. So I wouldn't rush to compare the situation to the UK and Israel. But of course, that when there is a rise in anti-Semitism, more and more Jews think about their future in the UK and more people talk about it. I can't give you statistics, but anecdotally, I know that Jewish people do feel concerned. We have seen it more in other countries where more French Jews leave and move to Israel because of anti-Semitism. So of course people are concerned when they feel like they are made to be the enemies in now a very mainstream conversation. Frankly, Jews don't want to be in the headlines. We saw it in 2019 with Labour anti-Semitism in Corbyn. We're seeing it now. We don't want to be spoken about constantly. And I would say I want people to talk about Gaza. I want people to talk about Israel. I wish they were talking more about that than they were talking about, for example, Stephen Fry.
Daniela, thank you so much for joining us here on talkTV. Philip, I mean, this is really, really concerning, this rise. But also, it doesn't seem like it's something that's going to go away in 2024, does it? We're here to stay.
It's not. It's been there for a long time. And it's applying a religious label to what is ostensibly a political issue that's going on. It wasn't just Jews that got massacred on the 7th of October. There were Christians, there were Muslims, and all the rest got killed by Hamas. There are Christians, there are Muslims being killed inside Gaza with Israel's response that's going on. So, and the power of misinformation, but then that echo chamber of misinformation being stimulated by disinformation deliberately coming in from different groups is really, really worrying.
Almost going back to the Trump fake news. Of course, Trump was the greatest producer of fake news, I think.